Maria awoke to another unassuming day, the same as every other for the past 5 years. Her alarm buzzed at 5:00 a.m., echoing through her modest one-bedroom apartment. She stretched, brushed off the grogginess, and quickly set about preparing breakfast for her teenage son, Daniel. Life had been a relentless uphill climb for Maria, but she faced each day with quiet determination. Today, however, would prove to be anything but ordinary. By 7:00 a.m., Maria arrived at the sprawling Henderson estate, a world that couldn't be further removed from her own. The grand mansion stood as a testament to wealth and power, its marble columns and expansive gardens a stark contrast to the cramped apartment she called home. Inside, the staff bustled about, readying the house for yet another day of hosting influential guests. Maria greeted the other employees with her customary smile, which often masked the exhaustion she felt after juggling 2 jobs and single-handedly raising her son. Mr. Henderson, the billionaire tech mogul, was known for his sharp business acumen and his ability to command respect in any room. To Maria, he was also a kind but reserved man who seemed burdened by the weight of his empire. Over the years, Maria had noticed that he often lingered in the kitchen, sipping coffee while quietly observing the staff. Occasionally, he would strike up a conversation with her, asking about her family or offering bits of advice. Their exchanges were always brief, yet they carried a sincerity that Maria rarely encountered elsewhere. This morning, as Maria meticulously arranged fresh flowers in the dining room, Mr. Henderson entered the room with an unusually light demeanor. He seemed distracted, yet a spark of excitement flickered in his eyes. "Maria," he called out, his tone unusually animated. "Could I have a word with you?" Maria wiped her hands on her apron and approached him, feeling a mix of curiosity and apprehension. It wasn't every day that the billionaire personally sought her out. "Of course, Mr. Henderson," she replied, her voice steadied despite her racing thoughts. He gestured for her to follow him into the study, a room Maria rarely entered. As they stepped inside, the air seemed to thicken with the weight of something unspoken. Mr. Henderson closed the door and turned to face her, his expression now serious. "Maria, I've been thinking about the upcoming business dinner," he began, pausing as if to choose his words carefully. Maria nodded, unsure of where the conversation was heading. She knew the dinner in question was a high-stakes event, a gathering of the most powerful CEOs and investors in the industry. It was all anyone in the house had talked about for weeks. "To put it bluntly," he continued, "I need this dinner to go perfectly. My company is at a critical juncture, and I need to remind these people of the values that built our success. But I think I've been going about it the wrong way." Maria tilted her head, confused. "I'm not sure I understand, sir," she said cautiously. Mr. Henderson took a deep breath. "I want you to speak at the dinner," he said, his voice steady, but his eyes searching hers for a reaction. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Maria blinked, certain she had misheard him. "Me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Speak at the dinner? In front of all those people?" "Yes," he replied, his tone resolute. "I know it sounds unconventional, but that's precisely the point. These people need to hear something real, something that will cut through the corporate jargon and remind them of what truly matters. And you, Maria, have a perspective that none of them do." Maria felt as though the floor had shifted beneath her. She searched his face for signs of a joke, but his expression was sincere. "But Mr. Henderson, I'm just a maid," she stammered. "What could I possibly say to people like that?" "Exactly," he said, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You're not one of them. You see things differently, and that's what makes your voice so powerful. I've watched how you carry yourself, how you approach life with resilience and grace. You've taught me more about humanity than any boardroom discussion ever could." Maria's mind raced. Public speaking was far outside her comfort zone, let alone addressing a room full of billionaires and CEOs. But beneath her fear, a flicker of something else began to emerge, a sense of possibility, of being seen and valued in a way she never had before. I don't know if I can do this, she admitted, her hands trembling slightly. What if I say the wrong thing? What if they laugh at me? Mr. Henderson stepped closer, his voice softening. Maria, I wouldn't ask you to do this if I didn't believe in you. Speak from the heart. That's all I ask. And if it helps, think of it as a chance to share your story. You've overcome challenges that most of them couldn't begin to understand. Let them see the world through your eyes. Maria hesitated, the weight of his request pressing heavily on her shoulders. But she also felt a strange sense of honor, a chance to stand in a space she never imagined she'd occupy. Finally, she nodded, her voice barely audible. I'll do it. A genuine smile spread across Mr. Henderson's face. Thank you, Maria. You don't know how much this means to me. As she left the study, Maria's thoughts swirled in a chaotic mix of fear, doubt, and determination. She had no idea how she would prepare for such an overwhelming task, but one thing was certain. This was no ordinary day. Unbeknownst to her, the decision she had just made would set in motion a chain of events that would forever alter her life, and the lives of everyone around her. Maria's walk back to the kitchen felt surreal, her mind buzzing with questions. How had her ordinary life taken such a sharp turn? She was a maid, not a speaker, and certainly not someone who belonged on a stage in front of the world's most powerful individuals. Yet Mr. Henderson's words replayed in her head. Speak from the heart. As the day wore on, Maria couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought her here. 5 years ago, her life had been in shambles. Her husband, a construction worker, had tragically passed away in an accident, leaving her to care for their young son, Daniel, on her own. With no higher education and little savings, Maria had been thrust into survival mode. She cleaned houses during the day and worked late shifts at a diner, all while trying to keep up with Daniel's school needs. The Henderson job had been a stroke of luck, or perhaps fate. A friend had recommended her for the position after hearing about an opening at the estate. Maria still remembered the day she first stepped foot in the mansion, her worn shoes echoing on the polished marble floors. She had felt out of place, surrounded by such grandeur. But the job paid well and offered stability, and Maria was determined to make it work. Over time, Maria had grown accustomed to the house's rhythms, learning how to navigate the unspoken rules of working in a wealthy household. Mr. Henderson, though aloof at first, had surprised her with his occasional moments of warmth. There was one evening, not long after she started, when she had found him sitting alone in the kitchen, his tie loosened and his expression heavy. Without thinking, she had offered him a cup of tea, the way her mother used to when she sensed someone was troubled. To her surprise, he had accepted. They had sat in silence for a while before he spoke. Do you ever feel like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders, Maria? He had asked. Maria had chuckled softly. Every day, sir. But I've learned that the trick is to take it one step at a time. That simple exchange had been the start of an unlikely bond. Over the years, Maria became someone Mr. Henderson could talk to during his rare moments of vulnerability. She didn't offer solutions. She simply listened, and perhaps that was why he valued her so much. In return, he treated her with a respect that stood out in a world where people in her position were often overlooked. But this latest request, this was far beyond anything she had ever imagined. As Maria replayed her conversation with Mr. Henderson, she couldn't shake the feeling that this dinner meant more to him than he was letting on. She decided to confide in her closest friend at the estate, Clara, the head housekeeper. Clara listened intently as Maria recounted what had happened. When Maria finished, Clara leaned back, her expression a mix of disbelief and admiration. Well, I'll be, she said, shaking her head. That man must have a good reason for asking you. But Maria, are you sure you're up for this? It's not just about saying a few words. These people will scrutinize everything. I'm terrified, Clara, Maria admitted. But how can I say no? He's always treated me with kindness. If he believes I can do this, maybe I should try. Clara gave her a reassuring smile. "You've got more courage than most people, Maria. Just remember, it's not about impressing them. It's about being yourself. That's what makes you special." Later that evening, as Maria rode the bus home, she began to think about what she might say. Her life wasn't glamorous, but it was real, filled with struggles and small victories. Perhaps there was something in her story that could resonate with these powerful individuals. But the fear of failure loomed large, threatening to overshadow her determination. When she walked through the door of her apartment, Daniel was sitting at the kitchen table, working on his homework. He looked up and grinned. "Hey, Mom. How was work?" "It was different," Maria replied, setting down her bag. She debated whether to tell him about the dinner but decided against it for now. Daniel had enough on his plate with school and college applications. He didn't need to worry about her nerves. Over the next few days, Maria began preparing in earnest. She spent her evenings scribbling down ideas in a notebook, trying to piece together a speech that felt authentic. But every time she read it back, it sounded wrong, forced, unnatural. She was on the verge of giving up when inspiration struck. One evening, Maria was cleaning the living room at the mansion when she noticed a photo album on the coffee table. It was open to a picture of a young Mr. Henderson, standing proudly in front of a small garage with a sign that read, "Henderson Innovations." He couldn't have been more than 25 years old, his face alight with ambition. Next to the photo was a handwritten note that read, "Remember where you started." Maria stared at the photo for a long time, a thought taking root in her mind. Mr. Henderson had built his empire from nothing, just as she was trying to build a life for her son. Perhaps their stories weren't so different after all. If she could tap into that shared humanity, maybe, just maybe, she could find the words she needed. The breakthrough came unexpectedly one night as Maria was helping Daniel with his homework. He was struggling with a history essay about great leaders, frustrated by the complexity of the topic. Why does it even matter? He had grumbled. They're just people who got lucky. Maria had paused, her heart aching at his disillusionment. "Leaders aren't just people who get lucky, Daniel," she said gently. "They're people who face challenges and make choices that inspire others. It's not about the titles or the power. It's about the impact they have on the world around them." Daniel had looked at her thoughtfully, and in that moment, Maria realized she had found the core of her speech. It wasn't about impressing the CEOs or proving she belonged in their world. It was about reminding them of the power of integrity, perseverance, and human connection. As the day of the dinner approached, Maria's nerves remained, but they were tempered by a newfound clarity. She didn't need to pretend to be someone she wasn't. All she had to do was speak from the heart, as Mr. Henderson had said. The day of the dinner arrived like an unwelcome storm. Maria woke up with a knot in her stomach, the weight of the evening pressing heavily on her chest. As she prepared for work, she tried to keep her focus on the tasks ahead, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the moment she would stand in front of the most powerful people she had ever encountered. Doubts plagued her mind. What if she froze? What if she embarrassed Mr. Henderson? What if her story didn't matter to anyone but herself? By the time she arrived at the Henderson estate, the house was already buzzing with activity. The staff scurried about, setting up tables, arranging decorations, and ensuring every detail was perfect. The main dining hall had been transformed into a luxurious venue, complete with crystal chandeliers, gold-accented tableware, and floral centerpieces that looked as if they had been plucked from a dream. Maria found herself caught between awe and unease. She had cleaned this room countless times, but tonight, she would step into it as something entirely different, not as a maid, but as a speaker. The thought made her hands tremble as she carried a tray of glasses to the serving station. Clara, noticing Maria's nervousness, approached her with a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "Maria, you're going to do fine," Clara said with a warm smile. "Remember, this isn't about impressing anyone. It's about sharing something real. You've got a good heart, and that's what people will see." Maria nodded, grateful for Clara's support, but the words did little to calm the storm inside her. She had spent nights writing and rewriting her speech, practicing in front of the mirror, and even rehearsing for Daniel. Each time, her voice wavered, and her thoughts felt scattered. Now, there was no turning back. As the evening drew closer, the guests began to arrive. Chauffeured cars pulled up to the grand driveway, and one by one, the elite of the business world stepped out, dressed in tailored suits and glittering evening gowns. Maria caught glimpses of them as she worked in the kitchen, their confident laughter and polished appearances only amplifying her insecurities. She overheard snippets of conversation about mergers, stock prices, and international ventures, topics as foreign to her as the moon. Mr. Henderson, looking dapper in a black tuxedo, entered the kitchen briefly to check on the preparations. When he saw Maria, he offered her an encouraging nod. "Are you ready?" he asked softly. Maria hesitated, then nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." He smiled. "That's all anyone can ask for. Just be yourself, Maria. That's what matters." As the dinner began, Maria stayed in the wings, watching as the guests settled into their seats. The atmosphere in the room was charged with energy, a blend of anticipation and prestige. Mr. Henderson stood at the head of the table, his presence commanding but approachable. He started with a brief welcome speech, thanking everyone for attending and highlighting the importance of the evening. His words flowed effortlessly, a reminder of why he had become such a respected figure in his industry. Then, unexpectedly, a rival CEO named Richard Calloway interrupted. Calloway was known for his sharp tongue and aggressive business tactics, and tonight was no exception. He raised his glass with a smirk and said, "Well, Henderson, I hope tonight's little gathering lives up to the hype. Word is, your company's been struggling lately. Care to address the rumors?" A murmur spread through the room, and Maria's heart sank. She could see the tension in Mr. Henderson's face, though he maintained his composure. "Every business faces challenges, Richard," he replied evenly. "But tonight isn't about competition. It's about collaboration and the values that unite us." Calloway leaned back in his chair, clearly amused. "Values, huh? I'm curious to see what kind of values you've got planned for tonight." Maria's pulse quickened. This wasn't just a dinner, it was a battlefield. The stakes were higher than she had imagined, and the pressure to deliver her speech felt overwhelming. She gripped the small note cards in her hands, her palms damp with sweat. Finally, the moment came. Mr. Henderson stepped forward and introduced Maria, his voice filled with a quiet confidence that steadied her nerves just enough to walk out from the shadows. As she approached the head of the table, the room fell silent, all eyes turning to her. The opulence of the setting, the weight of the gazes, everything threatened to crush her. But then she saw Mr. Henderson's nod of encouragement and Clara's supportive smile from the back of the room. She took a deep breath. "Good evening," Maria began, her voice trembling slightly. "My name is Maria, and I've worked here as Mr. Henderson's maid for the past 5 years. When he asked me to speak tonight, I thought he must have made a mistake. What could someone like me possibly say to people like you?" A ripple of polite laughter broke the tension, giving Maria the courage to continue. "But then I realized that maybe that's exactly the point. You see, I don't know much about business. I don't know how to analyze markets or negotiate deals. What I do know is resilience." Maria paused, her eyes scanning the room. The faces looking back at her were curious, some skeptical, but none dismissive. She felt a small spark of confidence. "I've faced challenges in my life that I never thought I'd overcome," she continued. "When my husband passed away, I lost more than a partner. I lost stability, security, and for a time, hope. But I had a son to raise, and giving up wasn't an option. So I cleaned houses, worked late shifts, and did whatever it took to keep us afloat. Along the way, I learned that success isn't about never falling. It's about getting back up every single time you do." Her voice grew steadier as she spoke, the words flowing more naturally. "Working for Mr. Henderson, I've seen the same kind of resilience. I've seen him face challenges that would make most people crumble. But what sets him apart isn't just his business acumen, it's his humanity. He treats people with respect, no matter their position. And that's why I believe in him, not just as a boss, but as a leader. The room was silent now, the weight of her words sinking in. Maria glanced down at her note cards, but realized she didn't need them anymore. She spoke from her heart, her voice filled with emotion and conviction. Leadership isn't about power or wealth. It's about lifting others up, about creating opportunities for people to thrive. That's what Mr. Henderson has done for me and so many others. And I hope tonight, as you think about the future of your businesses, you'll remember that true success isn't measured in profits. It's measured in the lives you touch. As Maria finished, she looked out at the audience, her chest tight with emotion. The silence that followed was almost unbearable, but then, one by one, the guests began to clap. The applause grew louder, more genuine, until it filled the entire room. Mr. Henderson stood, his expression one of quiet pride, and joined in the applause. Maria felt a wave of relief and gratitude wash over her. She had done it. She had spoken her truth, and it had resonated. What she didn't yet know was how deeply her words had impacted the people in that room, or how her life was about to change forever. What she didn't yet realize was that her story would not only change her life, but would also leave an indelible mark on everyone who heard it. The applause was deafening, reverberating through the grand dining hall like an unexpected thunderstorm. Maria stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest, trying to comprehend what had just happened. She had anticipated polite claps, maybe even a few uncomfortable smiles, but the standing ovation that followed was beyond anything she could have imagined. Her fingers gripped the edges of the podium, as if letting go might cause her to float away in the surreal moment. As the applause subsided, Maria caught Mr. Henderson's gaze. He nodded at her, a small but significant gesture of approval. She stepped back from the microphone, her legs trembling slightly, and returned to her seat at the edge of the room. The other staff members waiting in the wings greeted her with quiet, astonished smiles. Clara, who had been wringing her hands nervously throughout the speech, mouthed the words, "You were amazing." But the night was far from over. The silence that followed Maria's speech wasn't the awkward kind. It was the kind that left people deep in thought. The CEOs, many of whom had walked into the room expecting another evening of predictable corporate talk, now sat with expressions that ranged from contemplative to visibly moved. The atmosphere in the room had shifted. It was no longer about networking or business deals. Maria's words had reminded them of something they had long buried beneath layers of ambition, their own humanity. Then came the voice Maria least wanted to hear, Richard Calloway. He stood, adjusting his tie, his trademark smirk plastered across his face. "Well," he began, his tone dripping with sarcasm, "that was certainly unconventional. A maid delivering the keynote speech at a high-stakes business dinner. Bold move, Henderson. Very bold." The room tensed. Maria's stomach knotted as she feared Calloway's words would undo everything she had just accomplished. But before she could react, Mr. Henderson rose from his seat. "Unconventional, yes," Henderson said, his voice calm but firm. "But necessary. You see, Calloway, the people in this room have spent their lives building empires, myself included. In the process, we've sometimes lost sight of what truly matters. Maria reminded us tonight that our success isn't just measured by our profits, it's measured by the impact we have on others. If that makes you uncomfortable, perhaps it's because you've forgotten that lesson yourself." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Calloway's smirk faltered, replaced by a forced laugh. "Touché, Henderson. I just hope the board agrees with your, creative strategy here." With that, Calloway sat down, but the damage he intended to cause had already been mitigated. Mr. Henderson's words, combined with Maria's heartfelt speech, had swayed the room firmly in their favor. A few CEOs exchanged approving nods with Henderson. Their respect for him visibly deepened. Maria, still seated at the edge of the room, let out a quiet sigh of relief. But the night's surprises were far from over. After the dinner concluded, the guests mingled, engaging in hushed but animated conversations. Maria found herself the center of unexpected attention. Several attendees approached her, their questions and compliments flowing in rapid succession. "That was incredible," said a woman who introduced herself as the CEO of a major healthcare company. "Your story, it was a wake-up call. I've been so focused on hitting our quarterly targets, I think I've forgotten why I started this business in the first place." Another man, a venture capitalist with a reputation for being cutthroat, added, "You've got guts, Maria. That kind of authenticity is rare. If you ever want to explore new opportunities, let me know." Maria's cheeks flushed as she fumbled through her responses, unused to this level of attention. It felt surreal to be treated as an equal in a room full of people who normally wouldn't have given her a second glance. But amidst the praise and encouragement, one interaction stood out. An elderly man with a cane approached her slowly. He was introduced to her as Mr. Elliot, a retired business magnate who had once been a titan in the tech world. His presence commanded respect, and his sharp eyes seemed to see straight through her. "Young lady," he said, his voice deep and deliberate, "I've sat through more speeches than I can count in my lifetime. Yours was the first to make me feel something in years. You reminded me of a promise I made to myself a long time ago, a promise I failed to keep. I don't know how to thank you for that." Maria didn't know what to say. The sincerity in Mr. Elliot's voice left her momentarily speechless. All she could manage was a humble, "Thank you, sir. That means more to me than you know." As the guests began to depart, Mr. Henderson approached Maria. "Walk with me," he said, gesturing toward the garden outside. The cool night air was a welcome relief from the warmth of the crowded dining hall. They strolled in silence for a moment before Henderson spoke. "Maria," he began, his tone serious, "what you did tonight was nothing short of extraordinary. I asked you to speak because I believed in your ability to connect with people in a way that I can't. But even I underestimated just how powerful your words would be." Maria looked down, feeling both proud and overwhelmed. "I just spoke from my heart, like you told me to," she said quietly. "I never thought it would mean so much to anyone." Henderson stopped walking and turned to face her. "It meant everything. Not just to me, but to everyone in that room. And I'm not the only one who noticed. Several of the guests tonight want to collaborate with us now. People who were on the fence or leaning toward our competitors. Your speech tipped the scales." Maria's eyes widened. She hadn't realized the full impact of her words. "I'm glad I could help," she said, her voice filled with sincerity. "But I'm still just a maid." Henderson shook his head. "You're much more than that, Maria. And I don't think you realize how much potential you have, which is why I want to offer you something." Maria's heart skipped a beat. "Offer me something," she repeated, unsure of what he meant. "I want you to work with me in a new capacity," Henderson said. "As a consultant, your perspective is invaluable, and I think you could bring something unique to our company, a voice that reminds us of why we do what we do. It wouldn't be an easy transition, but I think you're ready for it." Maria stared at him, stunned. A consultant. She had never imagined such a possibility. Her first instinct was to decline, to retreat back into the familiarity of her current role. But something in Henderson's eyes told her this was more than a job offer. It was a belief in her, a belief she was just beginning to find in herself. I'll need to think about it," she said finally, her voice trembling. "Take all the time you need," Henderson replied with a smile. "Just know that no matter what you decide, you've already made a difference." As Maria walked home that night, the weight of the evening settled over her like a warm blanket. She had stepped out of her comfort zone in a way she never thought possible, and it had changed not only her life, but also the lives of everyone who had heard her words. Yet the journey was far from over. A new chapter was opening before her, filled with challenges, opportunities, and the chance to redefine who she was. For the first time in years, Maria felt something she hadn't dared to hope for: limitless possibility. The days following the dinner felt like a whirlwind Maria could barely keep up with. She returned to her usual duties at the Henderson estate, quietly hoping to fade back into the rhythm of her familiar life. But it was clear almost immediately that things had changed. The other staff looked at her with a mix of admiration and awe, their usual chatter now replaced with whispers about Maria's speech. Even Clara, her closest confidant, seemed to regard her with a new level of respect. "Maria," Clara said one afternoon as they folded linens together, "you realize you are the talk of the house, right? And not just here. People are talking about you all over town." Maria sighed, setting down the linen she was holding. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen, Clara. I just wanted to help Mr. Henderson." "And you did," Clara replied firmly. "More than you know. But maybe it's time you start seeing yourself the way the rest of us do." Maria smiled faintly, unsure of what to say. The truth was, she didn't feel like the confident woman everyone seemed to think she was. She still worried about paying rent, about Daniel's future, about whether she could ever truly escape the cycle of struggle that had defined her life. The idea of stepping into a new role, as Mr. Henderson had proposed, felt daunting, almost impossible. That afternoon, Maria found herself summoned to Mr. Henderson's office. She entered hesitantly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. He was seated behind his large oak desk, but his demeanor was far from intimidating. He gestured for her to sit, a warm smile on his face. "Maria, I wanted to thank you again for what you did the other night," he began. "The response has been overwhelming. Several of the CEOs who attended the dinner have already reached out with proposals to collaborate. And it's not just business. Your words have inspired them to think differently about how they lead." "I'm glad it went well," Maria said softly. "I wasn't sure if what I said would resonate." Henderson leaned forward, his expression earnest. "It did more than resonate. It changed people. And it got me thinking about something. Do you remember what I mentioned to you that night? About working with me in a new capacity?" Maria nodded, her stomach tightening. "I've been thinking about it, but I don't know if I'm the right person for that kind of role. I don't have the education or the experience. I'm just a maid." Henderson shook his head. "You're much more than that, Maria. And it's not about education or experience. It's about perspective. You see the world differently, and that's exactly what this company needs. I don't want someone who thinks like everyone else. I want someone who thinks like you." Maria hesitated, her mind racing. The idea of stepping into a consultant role, of having a voice in decisions that shaped the company, felt both thrilling and terrifying. She thought of Daniel, of the life she wanted to give him, and of the chance to finally break free from the constraints of her past. "What would this role involve?" she asked cautiously. Henderson smiled, sensing her interest. "You'd be working directly with me, providing input on initiatives that impact our employees, our customers, and the community. Your job would be to ensure that we never lose sight of the human side of what we do. It's a big responsibility, but I believe you're ready for it." Maria took a deep breath. "I'll need some time to think it over." "Of course," Henderson said. "Take all the time you need. But know this, whether you accept the role or not, you've already made an impact here. And for that, I'll always be grateful." Maria left the office feeling a mix of emotions: pride, fear, excitement, and doubt. She spent the next few days mulling over the decision, talking it through with Clara and eventually with Daniel. When she finally told her son about the opportunity, his reaction surprised her. "Mom, you have to do it," Daniel said, his eyes lighting up. "You've worked so hard for so long. This is your chance to show everyone what you're capable of. Besides, if anyone can handle it, it's you." Maria smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. Daniel's faith in her gave her the push she needed. The next morning, she walked into Henderson's office with her head held high. "I'll do it," she said simply. Henderson grinned. I knew you would. The transition wasn't easy. Maria faced skepticism from some of the company's executives, many of whom questioned her qualifications, but she quickly proved herself through her insight and authenticity. She brought a unique perspective to every meeting, often challenging the status quo in ways that earned both respect and admiration. One of her first initiatives was to improve working conditions for the company's lowest-paid employees. Drawing from her own experiences, Maria implemented programs that provided better healthcare benefits, flexible scheduling, and opportunities for advancement. The changes were met with overwhelming support, and employee satisfaction soared. Maria's journey didn't just transform her own life. It had a ripple effect on the entire community. Inspired by her story, other local businesses began adopting similar policies, creating a culture of empathy and respect that spread far beyond the Henderson Company. But perhaps the most unexpected impact was on the CEOs who had attended the dinner. Many of them reached out to Maria personally, seeking her advice on how to incorporate the values she had spoken about into their own organizations. One by one, they began to implement changes that prioritized people over profits, shifting the corporate landscape in ways Maria could never have imagined. Despite her new role, Maria remained humble. She still returned home each evening to her modest apartment, where she and Daniel would share dinner and talk about their day. She still visited Clara and the other staff of the Henderson estate, never forgetting the people who had supported her along the way. One evening, as Maria sat on the balcony of her apartment, reflecting on everything that had happened, Daniel joined her. "You've come a long way, Mom," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "Do you ever think about how different things might have been if Mr. Henderson hadn't asked you to speak that night?" Maria smiled, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "All the time," she admitted. "But you know what, Daniel? I think life has a way of putting us exactly where we're meant to be. Sometimes, we just need the courage to take the first step." Her words hung in the air, a quiet reminder of the journey she had taken, and the limitless possibilities that still lay ahead. Months passed, and Maria's life continued its extraordinary transformation. What had started as a simple opportunity to speak at a dinner had blossomed into a role that allowed her to reshape not only her own life, but also the lives of countless others. Yet, as the glow of her new position settled into something more routine, Maria found herself reflecting on the deeper meaning of her journey and how far she had come. Her days were now filled with meetings, presentations, and decision-making sessions with executives who once wouldn't have given her a second glance. But her role wasn't just about business strategy. It was about being a bridge between the corporate world and the real lives impacted by its decisions. Maria quickly became a trusted voice, someone who brought humanity and empathy into discussions that were often dominated by numbers and projections. One of her most significant projects was the launch of a community outreach initiative. Maria worked tirelessly to create programs that offered job training and resources for people in underprivileged neighborhoods. People like her, who just needed a chance. The initiative included scholarships, mentorships, and partnerships with local organizations, and it quickly became a model for corporate social responsibility. The ripple effects were profound. Maria's efforts didn't just uplift individuals, they brought entire communities together. People who had been struggling found hope and opportunity, and the Henderson Corporation gained a reputation as a company that truly cared. It was a win for everyone, and Maria's name became synonymous with the movement. But Maria's impact extended beyond the company. Her speech at the dinner had inspired a wave of change among the CEOs who had been in attendance. Several of them implemented similar programs in their own organizations, and one even created an annual Humanity in Business Award, with Maria as the first recipient. Each time she stepped onto a stage to share her story, she was met with standing ovations, not for her eloquence or her position, but for her authenticity. Despite her rising profile, Maria never lost sight of who she was or where she came from. She continued to live modestly, prioritizing her son Daniel's future and staying grounded in the values that had carried her through life's toughest moments. Daniel, Inspired by his mother's courage and determination, excelled in school, and earned a scholarship to a prestigious university. Watching him thrive became one of Maria's greatest joys. One evening, after a particularly long day, Maria found herself sitting in her apartment with Daniel, flipping through a stack of letters. These weren't just any letters. They were messages from people whose lives had been touched by her work. A single mother in the community thanked her for the job training program that had allowed her to support her family. A young man wrote about how the scholarship program had given him a chance to study engineering. A former factory worker shared how the new employee benefits had helped him afford critical medical care. As Maria read through the letters, tears filled her eyes. "I never thought my life would have this kind of impact," she said softly. Daniel looked at her with pride. "You've always had it in you, Mom. You just needed someone to see it, and to give you the chance to show the world." Maria smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. I guess it goes to show that even the smallest voices can create the biggest ripples. But not everything about her journey had been easy. Maria had faced her share of challenges along the way. There were days when she doubted herself, moments when she felt out of place in boardrooms filled with seasoned executives. There were critics who dismissed her as a symbolic figure rather than a real contributor. And there were times when the weight of her responsibilities felt overwhelming. What kept her going, however, was the support of the people who believed in her. Clara remained her steadfast cheerleader, often reminding Maria of how far she had come. Mr. Henderson continued to mentor her, treating her as a partner rather than an employee. And Daniel, her constant source of strength, encouraged her to keep pushing forward, even when the road seemed daunting. One day, while Maria was visiting the Henderson estate for a meeting, Mr. Henderson pulled her aside. "Maria," he said, "I've been thinking about something. You've done incredible work here, but I wonder if it's time for you to think even bigger." Maria raised an eyebrow, unsure of what he meant. "Bigger? How so?" Henderson smiled. "I think it's time for you to step into the spotlight fully. What you've accomplished here is remarkable, but your voice has the power to inspire people on a much larger scale. I'd like to sponsor you to speak at a global conference on leadership and social impact. It's an opportunity to share your story with the world." The idea was both exhilarating and terrifying. Maria had come so far, but the thought of addressing an international audience seemed almost too much to bear. Yet, deep down, she knew that her journey had been leading her to this moment. "Let me think about it," she said, her voice steady but her heart racing. That evening, Maria sat on her balcony, gazing at the stars. She thought about the twists and turns her life had taken, the challenges she had faced, and the people who had supported her along the way. She thought about the countless lives her story had touched and the possibility of reaching even more people. Finally, she made her decision. Weeks later, Maria stood on a stage in front of thousands of people from around the world. The conference hall was packed, the energy palpable. She took a deep breath, remembering the words Mr. Henderson had spoken to her on that fateful night. "Speak from the heart." And she did. Maria shared her story with a raw honesty that captivated the audience. She spoke about resilience, about finding strength in the face of adversity, and about the power of compassion and human connection. She spoke not as a maid or a consultant or an award recipient, but as a woman who had discovered her voice and used it to change the world. By the time she finished, the audience was on its feet, the applause echoing through the hall like a wave of affirmation. Maria stood there, overwhelmed by the moment, knowing that her journey was far from over. There were still challenges to face, still stories to tell, and still lives to touch. As she stepped off the stage, a thought lingered in her mind, a thought she hoped would resonate with everyone who heard her story. What if everyone, no matter where they started, had the chance to rise? Maria's story had begun in the shadows of a grand estate, but it had become a beacon of hope for people everywhere. And as she walked into the next chapter of her life, she carried with her the unshakable belief that even the smallest voices could create the biggest changes.